Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners. Welcome back to Inside the Tent, our show where we go behind the microphone of our favorite podcasts and talk to the people who brought them to life. I'm Josh Dean, Campside co-founder and host of shows like Hooked, Chameleon Hollywood Con Queen, and White Devil. And today I'm talking to journalist and radio host Celeste Headley about Big Sugar, which White Devil listeners will recognize as the globe-trotting investigative series that recently appeared in that show's feed. Big Sugar is a riveting and deeply reported show that takes you inside a very big business few of us have really considered. The multi-billion dollar business of sugar. Those tiny white crystals that help flavor, well, just about everything you eat or drink. If you want more exclusive content or behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our award-winning podcasts, make sure to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Now here's my conversation with journalist Celeste Headley. So, tell me what brought you to this story in the beginning.
The idea for the podcast came from an article written for Vanity Fair years ago about a case that involved migrant workers filing suit about wage theft against the big sugar companies. They wanted to turn that into a podcast and asked me if I'd be interested. And I told them the same thing I'll tell you, which is that this story brings together so many of the issues and subjects that I care about. Big business versus labor, immigration, racism. It brings together so many issues, income and wealth inequality, that I personally believe are massively holding back progress in not just the United States, but around the world, that it was a perfect subject to talk about.
And so, how long did you work on it?
At least 3 years' time. We had to travel. We had to travel to Florida. We had to go to the scene. We had to do a lot of interviews. Some of them were of the migrant workers who moved back to Haiti. Investigative work, it takes time. So, years.
How much did you know about the sugar industry before you embarked on this?
I think pretty minimal. I've lived in places where the environmental impact of agriculture was a big deal, but I've never lived in the places in the United States where sugar was the main crop, right? I've never lived in Florida, et cetera. So I never had to dig really deeply into this industry. I have to imagine that in many ways that makes me on a par with most Americans. I think most people, grab their couple spoonfuls of sugar or whatever to dump in their coffee and aren't fully aware of what it takes to get that sugar to their table, or the history of this industry in and of itself, and how important this history has been to the United States for so long. So yeah, I came to this fairly new.
So is sugarcane naturally occurring in the United States, or was it transplanted here?
It was transplanted here. It's native to New Guinea. We have lots of records of like the Papuan people and the Austronesian people farming sugarcane. But from there, from Papua New Guinea, some 6,000 years ago or so, it then spread to places that we now associate with sugarcane, right? Like the Caribbean and Southeast Asia and India. But it was only, as far as we can tell, thousands of years ago, only native to Papua New Guinea.
Wow. So started on one, very large island.
Yes.
But then now has spread all over the world and is a massive. What's the size of the sugar industry?
So, we're talking massive, right? First of all, globally, sugar consumption exceeds 185 million metric tons at this point. Just in the European Union, they consume almost 17 million metric tons of sugar. The sugar industry supports well over 120,000 jobs a year. And it's estimated the global sugar market, and again, this obviously changes on a daily, weekly basis, but the last time I checked, as of 2023, the sugar industry globally was estimated at about $67 billion. So by whatever measure that you're using, it's massive. It's also massive in terms of how much the American public pays for it, not just in terms of how much we spend to buy it, but U.S. taxpayers pay some $4 billion a year in subsidies to grow what is an extremely profitable crop.
And by the way, we pay for it in our dental bills and our medical bills.
Yep.
And
And sugar is more expensive here than anywhere else in the world, pretty much. So we're paying for it and paying for it and paying for it.
And the podcast focuses largely on the work of one family. Why did you guys choose them? And tell me a little bit about the Fanjuls, this native Cuban family that's now American by several generations, I think, right?
By at least a couple. So all of the Fanjuls that we're talking about in the story, at least, were born in Cuba and mostly raised in Cuba. But we didn't so much choose the Fanjuls as they chose themselves. The case that I mentioned before that involved wage theft on a massive scale, the Fanjuls and their companies were the only ones that chose not to settle, right? They fought that, even though it would have cost them less to simply settle and give the workers the money they were accused of stealing. They chose to spend the money continuing to litigate it anyway in appeal after appeal after appeal. So because we start with that case, it's such a perfect example of the abuse and oppression that is associated with the sugar industry and has always been. This is a family that was very, very wealthy in Cuba. In fact, one of their main palaces is now a massive, elaborate art museum. Very, very wealthy. When the revolution came, a lot of their land was nationalized. Their industries were nationalized. And so they took what wealth they could, which ended up being quite a bit, and fled to the United States and got to take advantage of some very pro-business and pro-sugar laws and policies that allowed them to rebuild their wealth here to the point where they are enormously wealthy. They are also famously private. We go into detail in the podcast about all the lengths we went to try to talk to the Fanjuls. Let me just tell you, we left out so much of that. We figured if we actually put in all of the ways and all the time that we spent trying to talk to the Fanjuls, we would lose listeners. And one of the things that I say in the over the course of reporting, and this is after we'd just left the offices of U.S. Sugar and been stopped from even going to talk to the receptionist. We couldn't even go use the elevator. And it occurred to me how, when you're wealthy in the United States, you don't have to answer questions. You are protected from ever having to answer a question about anything that you do. Like, it's not just not being held legally accountable. You're not accountable by any measure. And I think to myself about how often I'm asked to justify myself, how often I'm forced to explain my thinking. What were you thinking? At work, at home, in the grocery store, whatever. And I think, this is one of these common experiences of life that being rich in the United States means you never have to experience. And this is the Fanjuls' story. They are incredibly well connected politically. There's the two brothers, Alfie and Pepe, and one of them donates to Republicans, the other one donates to Democrats, so that no matter who's in power, they have an in. And they're one of the companies, and there's only a few, that dominate the sugar industry.
So what's the closest you got to speaking with either of them?
I didn't even catch a glimpse of them. And, we waited outside their homes. We weren't trying to be stalkers, but we literally couldn't get into their business. We couldn't get them on the phone. We couldn't get an email to them. Like, we were making copies of physical letters and leaving them with the security guard down near the front doors of the building, because that's as far as we could go. We dropped them in their mailboxes. That's as close as we got. I guess the answer to that is the closest I got was dropping a physical copy of a letter in their mailbox.
So is the situation improving for the laborers? Like, have these lawsuits, and I believe there have been updates, I think just this year, are they winning in any substantive way? Are the conditions improving? Are they getting paid more? Is their money not being stolen?
So there's a few things in what you're talking about. There was a massive lawsuit filed against Fanjul Corporation and Florida Crystals that alleged they were greenwashing. In other words, claiming to use environmentally friendly practices when they were very much not, and for using harmful farming practices. This is one of the things that we went down to see if that was true or not. So I'm not an environmentalist or environmental scientist, but I can tell you what we found, which is that the workers don't feel safe. They do experience respiratory ailments. They have motorized a lot of the harvesting practices that ended up with people cutting off limbs and fingers and things. So that is safer only because a large machine is doing it. But there's still a lot of the process, like the crushing of the cane and all of those things that have to be done. And that's crushing of the cane, boiling it down. It's very dangerous. People get burnt. People get respiratory ailments from the sugar dust that's in the air. But even more so, we went to one of the towns where a lot of these workers live, and they do not need to, but they still, because it's the cheapest way to do it, they burn their sugar fields down at the end of the season after they've harvested. Now, again, they do not need to do that. But when you go to that town, when they're in the middle of burning, which we did, the first thing we did was we pulled into a close parking lot, and it was a parking lot right next to a burning field. And I'm talking about acrid smoke pouring off of this field. And you could see wildlife, toads and mice fleeing for their lives. This parking lot was the parking lot of an elementary school. And I stepped out of the car and almost immediately started getting covered in this sticky ash all over me and in my hair. And I was breathing it. And this is happening so that it surrounds this town. Like, you can't escape it. So that lawsuit was filed in district court for the Northern District of California. This was against the Fanjuls and their company, the Fanjul Corporation and Florida Crystals. And we'll see where that one goes. The workers lost their suit, and they lost it based on a centuries-old law that actually came up again with the Trump administration. But they lost it using like an incredibly old, mostly forgotten, arcane, nitpicky law. Florida State University has said that the ash from burning sugar, the people who live there call it black snow, and it kills at least 5 people every year. That's the ones that we can absolutely, not correlation, but causation, say this ash killed them. So we're not just talking about wages. And again, these workers are still today are paid very little. I mean, the town that we went through is just crippled by poverty. But we're also talking about the impacts on the environment itself.
The alternative, I assume, is just replowing or sowing under. Like,
have you ever seen like an actual live sugarcane plant?
I don't think I have, no.
Sugarcane is massive, right? Like some of these canes, listeners can't see my hands, but they are inches across. I cannot get my hand all the way around some of these canes.
Like a medium-sized tree trunk?
Yeah, and the roots are incredibly strong. So yeah, it's not easy, but it's also not prohibitively expensive. There are other countries, in South America, they passed laws saying you're not allowed to burn the frickin' fields down anymore. And it has barely made a blip in terms of how much it costs them to do business. And the thing, and this is one of the notes that the law firm that filed this case, it's a public interest law firm. One of the things that they note very deliberately is that all the while that they're choosing to do this, they are putting out claims to consumers, to shoppers who are looking for those green labels, saying that they're using environmentally friendly methods.
So just a lie.
I cannot say that nowhere in the process of producing their sugar are they not using environmentally friendly methods, but it certainly creates this idea that this is an environmentally friendly company, and it's not true.
And you mentioned that a lot of the laborers have gone back to Haiti. Is it Haitians primarily who are tending the fields in Florida?
It was a lot of Haitians. They were taking advantage of the immigrant worker program here that allowed them to pay far under minimum wage. And if a worker was complaining about their treatment, they would put them in these just horrible kind of barracks, maybe. Often they didn't have working facilities. They certainly didn't have working kitchens or anything, just horrible conditions. And they would bring them from around the Caribbean. A lot of Jamaicans, the people that we spoke to were Jamaicans. And then, the beauty of using these workers is that if somebody complains, they can deport them. with zero due process, because the only reason they're there is because they're on that visa that allows them to take this job. And so if the employer says we're going to fire you, they don't have to justify that. They don't have to give a reason, and then they get deported.
And then they have no recourse to actually.
Zero recourse. Some of these workers were making like $30 a day, and we're talking about freaking grueling work. At least every year they would bring in like 10,000 workers to Florida among the sugar companies based there to cut this cane. It's interesting because one of the workers that we interviewed, Selvin Grant at Jamaican, he was nicknamed Power. And all I kept thinking was he had no power. None of them had any power. And these workers came in and did this incredible work, sacrificing their bodies and their health so that we could have sugar on our tables. And we as Americans betrayed them. This whole thing just made me feel horrible.
Can you describe what the work? I mean, you said the work is grueling. Like, literally, what are they? Cutting cane involves what?
So they put on armor. And first of all, they're in completely open fields right in the middle of South Florida in the summer.
So hot, humid.
And they put on armor because the machetes are so sharp. They have to be incredibly sharp because otherwise you can't get through that cane. And essentially, when you watch the videos of them doing it, they'll grab the cane with one hand and then with a really strong, powerful stroke, lean down as close to the ground as possible so they can cut the cane and preserve as much of it as possible. And then they throw the cane to the side into these piles, and then they move on to the next cane. And they do this all day long, 10, 12 hours a day in the sun. It's considered to be one of the hardest jobs.
And so I would presume it's mostly men?
It was, yeah. They would do these really intrusive exams of these men because they wanted people who would be able to survive the work. They would get their health records. They would do and I don't want to get gross, but very intrusive physical exams. The Belle Glade, which is the name of the town I've been talking about before, this town where a lot of the workers live. This is where the U.S. Army used to send people to train them for missions in underdeveloped countries to see if they could hack it. I can't even describe it, how difficult their lives were and their work was.
And so if these workers just decided it's not worth it, like what would these companies do? Like, it's not like Americans are going to do these jobs, right? Like, I can't imagine a lot of like 25-year-old Floridians are going to sign up for this duty.
They kept threatening these workers that if they insisted on getting paid more, and they were expected to harvest like 8 tons of cane in an 8-hour day. And if they didn't harvest that much, they would fire them and they'd be deported, right? We're talking about them coming from countries like Jamaica, like Haiti, where those nations had been so depleted and impoverished that the money that they were making here was still better than what they were earning at home. And they would make this deal, and they talked about choosing to make this deal that they would bring home a little extra money that would help out their families and set them up for success. They'd be able to send their kids to school. And they knew it was going to be something they may never recover from, right? They would come home with debilitating scars, and that was if they were lucky. If they weren't lucky, they'd be losing a finger or worse. They also would sell them this storyline, right, about coming to the United States and making your fortune. And they were very good at selling that storyline. So, yeah, the workers could have just refused to do it. But I cynically believe they would have just gone to a different country and imported them from there.
Did you emerge from this reporting with any hope for the situation improving? Like, is there any positive note to end on here? Or is it just not being scrutinized and lawsuits are failing and basically sugar's not going to change? Big sugar's not going to change, I should say.
So I don't think sugar is not going to change. They won't change on their own, but the hopefulness here is that we can make them change. And this isn't even about us having to sacrifice for progress, because I cannot emphasize this enough, Americans are already paying the highest prices for sugar in, I think, the world, if not the developed world. So we can, make the H-2 visa program more equitable, and better. We can hold companies accountable. Think of it this way. If you stole $100 from your employer, that's a crime, right? You're going to go to jail. If your employer steals from your paycheck, shorts your paycheck $100, that's actually not a crime in the United States. It is not. They may have to pay it back, which again, unlikely, because you'd have to get the AG or office to take that case on, and that's really difficult to do. So they may have to pay it back, but nobody's ever going to be charged with a crime. So can we hold them accountable? We absolutely can. But we have to decide that, if I poison you and murder you, I'm a murderer. If a company poisons 1,000 people, it's not a crime. It's a civil case, right? So we have the power to change all of this. We can even just go in and demand that our legislators stop approving the sugar subsidies in the Farm Bill. Maybe stop paying them billions of dollars to buy another yacht. That would be awesome. We could enforce wages so that it doesn't become a business model to steal wages, because it is right now. The wage theft is the largest and most common theft in the United States. Wage theft, in terms of the value of money stolen, completely overshadows burglary, robbery, auto theft, muggings, pickpocketing, all of it combined. So we can change this. The question is, do we have the will, and are there just too many things going wonky right now for us to pay attention to sugar?
Well, yeah, that's true. Like, how do you even focus your energy?
Yeah.
I mean, are you still eating sugar? It's hard not to eat sugar.
I tried. Over the course of this podcast, I did try to stop eating sugar. And I got to tell you, I don't think most people realize how many things it's in. Bread. Like, they have been super successful at marketing sugar. So sugar is now in everything. In order to get rid of sugar, I would have been having to make a lot of my own stuff. And I don't have time. So I cut back on it. And I try to avoid it as much as possible. But that requires this kind of dedication that at this point I don't have.
Yeah, it really is in everything.
It's in everything.
Thanks so much to Celeste and the rest of the Big Sugar team, Imagine Podcasts, and iHeart. And thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.